Hi, my name is Luis, and I'm talking about the Seahawks today, the topic of my infographic. I'm a proud fan, but that's not why I wanted to do my infographic on the Seahawks. The reason I wanted to do it is because there are a lot of associated stereotypes with football, especially here in Seattle. It can be thought of by some as a kind of a brutish sport, kind of like a thing for jocks, and people in Seattle, again, stereotyping, have a tendency to kind of think of it that way. The team has had tremendous success over the years, but despite that, I feel that there's two kinds of fans. There's diehard fans, and then there's people who don't really care about the sport or the organization, but don't mind it, and they like to celebrate it because it's kind of the social norm. It's cool to wear Seahawks stuff, but we as fans get a lot of flack for being fair weather fans, especially this year when the team didn't look so great. We got a whole lot of pessimism. Turnout at the stadium was especially low compared to previous years. And there was just a lot of pessimism. And it felt like the fans kind of turned on the team on a dime after some incredible success in the past few years. And so I kind of wanted to do something to combat that. So I chose the Seahawks. And kind of the story that I'm trying to paint is a picture of the team, of the organization, the people that are made up of it, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I don't just talk about good things in my infographic. I talk about things that are bad as well. Like, for example, their red zone inefficiencies. I show some numbers up there on my infographic that paint a picture about how that's one area where they've really struggled. And I talk a lot of good things about them as well, but I kind of wanted to just present a picture to someone who's not necessarily a fan, but to fans too, as kind of like a resume for the team. So that's what I'm trying to accomplish. Here's what my infographic looks like. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I wanted to show you what the overall picture looks like before I dive into the individual components. And I also wanted to talk about my emulation models because that's what I based my infographic off of. So I based my color model off of this infographic, which in turn based its color model off of the Seahawks jersey. And I wanted to use these colors because I wanted to exploit the recognizability of the Seahawks colors. These colors and these particular shades of these colors are not particularly common. They're not used in conjunction very often. And when they are, it's almost always for the Seahawks. So there's a lot of recognizability. So even if I just included these colors and had no visual shape for my audience to recognize, they'd probably pick up that it's the Seahawks. So I wanted to make sure that I use those colors. So this is why I chose my color model. My visual model, I wanted to choose one that had some kind of football elements that I could use to emulate. So this is a great model for me. It's very blocky, has kind of some cartoonish figures with a lot of fill and not a whole lot of stroke. So definitely took advantage of that. Some good labels that I was able to use. The field was a great visual to emulate as well. Yeah. My typography model was a pretty simple one. I wanted some nice simple text. Some of the characteristics of this typography model is a lot of use of caps, and pretty much only two fonts, the Franklin Demicond and the Myriad Pro, for titles and for labels. And there's also some other Franklin Medium Con, which looks very similar, but I didn't use that one. But yeah, those are my models. Okay, so for visual potential, beginning with location. So location, to me, it means to use position on a screen to represent the position of things relative to each other in the real world. And I did this in my location elements by exploiting the visual potential of the relationships by answering the question of where did the Seahawks score touchdowns from in the red zone this year? And I encoded by color, so you can see that the green dots are representing plays where they scored, and the more numerous blue dots are the plays where they did not score. And you can see that there is very few green dots towards the front. There's quite a lot towards the back half, but the front is very, very low. So you can see in the middle forwards, there's only 5 points where they scored. So that's what I was trying to convey, that they were having a lot of trouble scoring touchdowns in the red zone this year. So yeah, that's my location, visual potential. And for numbers, to me, the visual potential exploitation for numbers means to use the number or amount or size of things on a page to represent the number or amount of size of things in the real world. So the way I did that is I exploited the visual potential of numbers in 2 ways. So on the image on the left, I did that by showing the correlation between values. And those 2 values are the defensive ranking in the NFL, so like how good your team was on defense compared to the rest of the teams in the NFL. And the other value being the number of wins that they had in a season, ranging from 0 to 14 possible wins. So you can see that there is a clumping of values to the right, so more wins, and those are typically associated with having a good defense. And I kind of showed a cool little pattern of where that kind of break point is, and that's the typical cutoff for making the playoffs. So you can see that there's a strong correlation for the Seahawks of having a good defense and winning games. So they're just known for being a defensive team. And they've had a great defense the past couple of years, and that's why they've been good. So the second display, visual potential for numbers, is being exploited by comparing amounts across categories. So the categories being the coaches and the amounts being the wins. You can see that Pete Carroll, by kind of a long shot and average wins, is kind of dominating the scene, and he's the second most longest tenured coach, so that's pretty impressive. So that just goes to show that we have a great coach, and he has a lot to do with the Seahawks' current success. And for appearance, to me, exploiting visual potential for appearance means to use representations that viewers will recognize or that will teach viewers about how something looks. And I chose to do that by exploiting how viewers will recognize a shape. In this example, the silhouette of Russell Wilson, quarterback, football player. It's not necessarily clear that this is Russell Wilson, but it's clear that this is a football player by the shape and by the football in his hand. And specifically, you can tell this is a Seahawks football player by the use of color. So I kind of used 2 different methods to show specifically that this is a Seahawks football player. And this is in trying to show also that this topic is going to be about the Seahawks. So yeah, that's appearance. For visual potential of relationships, to me that means showing a connection between shapes on a screen and having those represent connections between things in the real world. And the way that I did that is by showing a source to destination relationship between starters on offense in 2016 and where they were selected in the draft. So you can see that there's a whole lot of players being selected in the undrafted free agent section on the far right. There's only 1 player in the first round, another one in the second round, 2 in the third, and so forth, which is really pretty special and unique about the Seahawks. You know, typically if you draft a player in the first round in the draft and they become a starter, that's considered a success. But a lot of the times that doesn't happen. So it's pretty impressive that not only are undrafted free agents being signed by this team, but they're being able to start often. And they've developed into great players. So that just means that the front office does a great job of finding players that are not exactly appreciated by other teams in the league and helping them reach success by maximizing their potential. And I think that's pretty special about the Seahawks and something that's characterized their recent success, their ability to turn nothing into something. So for the visual potential of time, to me that means using relative position along a timeline to represent connections between things in the real world. So I did that by showing the sequence of playoff appearances and how unbalanced those appearances are towards the past few years. So you can see the left side of the graph has a lot of empty spots, and the right side has a whole lot of non-empty spots. And furthermore, you can see that the right side is a lot more continuous. You can see from 2010 almost to 2016, every year we've been in the playoffs. Whereas on the left side of the graph, there's a lot of more empty spots where they didn't make it. So, for example, between 1988 and 1999, they didn't make any playoff appearances. So I'm trying to show that the past few years have been quite dominant. To make the playoffs so consistently in a league that is so balanced and has so much parity in place is really quite remarkable, and it's something to be appreciated. Okay, so for the encoding, one thing to ask is what encodings did I use in my display? So the two displays that primarily took advantage of encoding are the location display on the left and one of my numbers display on the right. So the one on the left uses encoding to show which dot on this bubble graph is either a touchdown or a pass incomplete. And the one on the right uses encoding to separate the data into two buckets. When did they make the playoffs? When did they not make the playoffs? And this is kind of a rough estimate, because there's some points where they did not follow that rule, but that's that 9-point marker right about there is pretty much where they most of the time made the playoffs. So I used color to encode where this is happening, mainly to show the pattern of kind of this wall that they hit when they don't have a good defense. They just don't win enough games to make the playoffs. So that's the two encodings that I used and why. And for color, I had a lot of difficulty with color because my color model is pretty restricted on the number of colors that I can use. If you remember, I mentioned that I have pretty much 3 colors: this dark blue, the bright green, and the gray, and then various shades of gray. So I had a lot of trouble getting the color right. I had to play around with it a lot, but typically I used gray as the background, black for the text titles, and the gray for the annotation backgrounds. And then I often alternated blue and green for displays where that made sense. And I also often use green to highlight. Like for example, this Super Bowl win, I highlighted it with green. And I also highlighted the edges of the end zone in this one with green as well. Okay, so for text, I've shown a small version of my infographic here, but I use basically 2 different type fonts. I use the Franklin Gothic Demi-Cond for the titles, like you can see here, here, and here. And I use the Myriad Pro for the labels and annotations. So like you can see these gray boxes with white text, that's Myriad Pro. And for the axes labels, I also use Franklin Demi-Cond. And then for the numbers along the axis here, I use Franklin Medium Cond. And that's in line with my typography model. They use those title fonts for the title fonts, and the smaller annotations, they use Myriad Pro. So I followed that. And for precision labels, so like explaining the numerical value represented by visual elements, I use that all over the place, like the axes on my graph, or these values in my numbers display down here with the coaches. And identity labels I don't use a whole lot of. In fact, I don't use them at all. And that is in line with my visual model. So for my visual hierarchy, I've created a visual hierarchy that it kind of goes from left to right. And I'm exploiting the fact that a viewer typically will read from left to right. So to try to follow that, I made my largest image be on the left-hand side. So that's kind of where your attention is supposed to be drawn, either to this image of the quarterback, or to this larger logo of the Seahawks And since this is an opinionated pro Seahawks infographic, I made the good stuff big and noticeable on the left, and kind of the more bad stuff on the right. And it's kind of marginalized by the viewer's natural tendency to read from left to right and by its size. So like the negative image that I have about the Seahawks here is their red zone efficiency. It's poor, as you can see by the sparse number of green dots on the closer side to the end zone, and also their inability to develop early round picks is also exemplified here as the number of undrafted free agents that are starting on the team. You can see that as a good thing or a bad thing. So that's why I put that on the far right side as well. So moving on to layout, I laid out my elements according to this layout model, this doctor infographic. So things are grouped by boxes, and those groups are separated by white space, as you can tell. And there's a lot of vertical dashed lines separating some of these inner boxes. So I emulated that. And yeah. So regarding the alignment of this layout model, looking here, a lot of the text is left aligned, including the text and the subtext for each section. So I followed that here. Everything is left aligned along this column and along this column. Actually, some stuff here is misaligned, but that's because this isn't my final. If you look at my portfolio, the final one is aligned correctly. I just included the wrong one. But I follow that alignment everywhere. And things are horizontally aligned where possible as well. So you can see these titles are horizontally aligned, and also here. And yeah, thank you very much. I had a lot of fun with this class. I came in not really knowing what to expect, having very little exposure to my creative side. You know, as a developer, it's not something that I really do very often. So I have a much stronger dev background, but I wanted to try something new. And this class has really pushed me out of my comfort zone and taught me quite a few things about visual information design. And I've gained a new appreciation for the subject. So thank you for being a great teacher and showing me how to get more in touch with my creative side. Thank you.